Welcome to the lecture on the second of René Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy. I'm Andrew Chapman, and in this lecture we'll be looking at the question, what is the mind? In order to look at this question, we won't be presupposing anything about the nature of the mind before we get into asking the questions that are fundamental to our investigation. So, the question as we ask it will be broadly philosophical and won't be, for example, metaphysical, religious, or scientific from the outset. Now, it might be the case that we need to get into metaphysical, religious, scientific investigations once we've decided on the overall nature of what the mind is. But as you'll see, asking this question in the broad philosophical sense that we're asking it requires us to shed all presuppositions about the way the world is and the way that the mind is related to the world. In order to follow Descartes through his methodology in asking what the mind is, we'll first look at the claims that Descartes makes about the powers and functions of the mind, and we'll look at a number of arguments made by Descartes about the nature of the mind and its relation to the nature of the body. We'll take a look at Descartes' own solution to the question of what the nature of the mind is, and then look at the primary problem for a Cartesian account, a problem that philosophers influenced by Descartes are still attempting to solve to this day. Says Descartes, I shall direct my attention to the thoughts that spontaneously and by nature's prompting came to my mind beforehand whenever I considered what I was. The first was that I have a face, hands, arms, and this whole mechanism of limbs such as we see even in corpses. This I referred to as the body. Next, that I took nourishment, moved, perceived with my senses, and thought. These actions indeed I attributed to the soul. What this soul was, however, either I never considered, or I imagined it as something very rarefied and subtle, like a wind or fire or thin air infused into my coarser parts. What Descartes calls soul will be calling mind, just to get a broader context and to leave aside any potential religious implications. But by using a different term, I don't intend to bias the discussion against or for particular religious views. I'm just trying to give us some terminology that not only is broad enough to make sense of even non-religious thoughts about the mind, but also is in line with the way that philosophers talk about the mind and the philosophy of mind today. René Descartes was a French Enlightenment philosopher, scientist, and mathematician, and was called by many the father of modern philosophy, and this label, to my mind, is apt. Descartes was the most prominent rationalist philosopher during the Enlightenment period. A rationalist is a philosopher who thinks that it's possible, at least sometimes, for us to have knowledge or justification, where that knowledge or justification doesn't come entirely from our senses. So there's something that we might be able to know, or there are some things we might be justified in believing or doing that we end up getting, we end up receiving somehow through non-sensory means. In Descartes' Meditations on First Philosophy, he appeals to a standardized methodology that he creates in the first meditation over and over again in order to try to answer the particular questions that he set before himself. And while the methodology itself is laid out in epistemological terms, it would be a mistake to think of Descartes' project as only an epistemological project. Even though he starts out with an epistemological question, in order to answer the question, he needs to investigate issues of metaphysics, of ethics, of religion, and the interrelations between all of these different questions. So it's important to recognize that what Descartes is doing here isn't just epistemology, but something much, much more. Says Descartes in the first meditation, "Prudence dictates that we should never fully trust those who have deceived us, even once." What he means by that is that via his investigations, via his meditations, he'll never trust a source of evidence or justification that has ever shown itself to be unreliable. His goal is to, as much as possible, believe only true things. So Descartes' plan overall is to find the most certain, most sure foundation for all of his knowledge, and once he's found that, to build up from there. Descartes' overall plan in the Meditations looks like this. First, enumerate all the different sources of justification, then determine which sources of justification can be deceptive and which cannot, and then finally decide that if a source of justification can be deceptive, that the truth of all knowledge or belief grounded in that source of justification should be doubted. In the first meditation, Descartes decides that he might be wrong about everything he knows. And that's where we pick up in the second meditation, with Descartes having decided that everything he believed in the past might be false, and therefore he has decided to doubt everything that he's believed in the past. While the first meditation is primarily concerned with epistemological questions and gets us started on the investigation, the second of the meditations, the one that we're focusing on in this lecture, is primarily concerned with issues that relate to the philosophy of mind. The philosophy of mind is a philosophical subdiscipline that is still with us today, and so it'll help us when looking at this particular text to understand just broadly what the philosophy of mind is. Philosophers of mind are concerned with what minds are, what minds can do, and how minds are able to do what it is that they can do. And some of the paradigm questions that are asked by philosophers of mind are, what is the nature of mind? What kind of substance is the mind? What is the relation between minds and bodies? Now, these three questions are all questions that are asked by Descartes in the second meditation, the subject of this lecture. Philosophers of mind are also concerned with the question, what are the different sorts of mental states? What are the contents of mental states? What's the relation between the mind and the world? And finally, what is the nature of consciousness? This final question is the question that concerns many, if not most, contemporary philosophers of mind. But at the beginning of the early modern period, when Descartes was writing, there was a fascination with the newly inaugurated set of investigative tools that overall were referred to as the scientific method. And the scientific method allowed people to investigate things that they in the past could only speculate about, or that they thought maybe weren't even investigable. So Descartes is using scientific methodology in order to investigate the questions of what's the nature of mind, what sort of substance is the mind, and what's the relation between minds and bodies. It's also important in understanding the philosophy of mind to compare the philosophy of mind to the empirical sciences that are concerned with brains and minds and mental states. Philosophers of mind are generally interested in the nature of and possibilities for particular mental states. So notice that philosophers of mind are concerned with foundational questions about the essence of things. Empirical scientists who study the brain and related phenomena are generally interested in the physical underpinnings or correlates of mental states. So while these are similar sets of questions, empirical scientists are already presupposing something about their investigations, which is that their investigations are concerned with physical phenomena, and even further, the sorts of phenomena that can be investigated via the senses, where philosophers of mind don't make that assumption, although philosophers of mind might arrive at the conclusion that the best way to investigate the mind is via the empirical sciences. But asking the question of what the best way to investigate the mind is itself a philosophical question that can only be answered by doing the philosophy of mind. Now, neither the philosophy of mind nor the empirical scientist makes the mere assumption that the mind equals the brain, that they are one and the same sort of entity, that wherever you've got a mind, you've got a brain, and vice versa. We would have to have an argument in favor of that claim, so you might think that before you can even start doing empirical science, you need to do the philosophy of mind. And finally, while there is overlap in the topics that are studied by philosophers of mind and empirical scientists, for example, consciousness, the particular questions that are asked by philosophers of mind and by empirical scientists are distinct. So a philosopher of mind might ask, what is the nature of consciousness, while an empirical scientist might ask about particular neural patterns during particular states of consciousness. Back to Descartes. One of the things that Descartes is most famous for is an argument that's come to be known in the philosophical literature and the communities of philosophers as the Cogito argument. And no doubt you've heard of this argument before. However, the argument is often misunderstood by non-philosophers, so I'll lay it out in full here and then explicate it. Says Descartes, "But I convinced myself that there was nothing at all in the world, no sky, no earth, no minds, no bodies. Did I, therefore, not also convince myself that I did not exist either? No, certainly I did exist if I convinced myself of something. But there is some deceiver or other supremely powerful and cunning who is deliberately deceiving me all the time. Beyond doubt, then, I also exist if he is deceiving me. And he can deceive me all he likes, but he will never bring it about that I should be nothing as long as I think I am something. So that, having weighed all these considerations sufficiently and more than sufficiently, I can finally decide that this proposition, I am, I exist, whenever it is uttered by me or conceived in the mind, is necessarily true." So what does Descartes mean by all of that? Well, here's the argument laid out in premise form. If I think that I exist when I actually don't, then I'm deceived about my own existence. That's just what it means to be deceived about your own existence. All deception depends on the existence of a subject who is the thing deceived. If we say that deception is going on, well, there has to be a thing that's the thing being deceived. Deception doesn't just float around unattached to subjects being deceived. But if I think that I exist when I actually don't, then I do exist, and I'm the subject of deception. So, if you think that you exist and you actually don't, well, then you must exist. Now, if you notice, we're getting very close to contradictory territory here, you're right. And so we can conclude from 1, 2, and 3 that it's not possible for me to be deceived about my own existence. If I think that I exist but I'm wrong, there's still something that's doing the thinking, and the thing that's doing the thinking is me. Now, we haven't yet said anything about the nature of what I am. We're not there yet. But what Descartes is showing here is that while you can doubt the existence of almost everything, there's one thing that you can't doubt the existence of, and that's you. Because if you doubt the existence of you, that shows that you are around to doubt your own existence. And so you can never be correct when you doubt your own existence. Insofar as you're able to think at all, you must exist. And so we can restate that argument very simply. If I'm thinking, then I exist. And in the Latin, cogito ergo sum. Now, just a caution here. Some people have misinterpreted cogito ergo sum, having not read the Meditations, presumably, as what it means to be a human is to be a thing that's involved in the life of the mind or something like that. Well, clearly that's not what Descartes had in mind here. All he was saying is that you can prove to yourself that you exist by just thinking about whether you exist or not. That doesn't tell you anything about whether the life of the mind is essential for existing or something like that. There's a joke that plays on the ambiguity here, although it's unclear how much the author of the joke understood what was going on, but the joke goes like this. Descartes walks into a bar and the bartender says, "Can I get you something to drink?" And Descartes says, "I think not," and then he disappears. Poof, out of existence. Well, let's move on to what Descartes considers the functions of minds versus bodies. So Descartes has tried to doubt everything that he can possibly doubt and arrived at one and only one thing that he couldn't doubt, that he exists. Now that he's figured out that he exists, he's going to try to build back up from there, seeing what he can possibly know now that he knows that he exists. And the first way to do that is to look at what minds do, what the sorts of things that think that can't possibly not exist if they are thinking, what those sorts of things do, and to compare them to bodies. Says Descartes, "The first thing that I thought about myself was that I have a face, hands, arms, and this whole mechanism of limbs such as we see even in corpses. This I referred to as the body. Next, that I took nourishment, moved, perceived with my senses, and thought. These actions, indeed, I attributed to the soul or mind." So what he's saying in this quotation, which we saw also at the beginning of the lecture, is that it seems correct to attribute different powers, abilities, and functions to the mind and to the body. They seem to do different things. Now, this on its own doesn't tell us anything about whether the mind and the body are the same thing or different things, or what the relation is to each other. It's just the beginning of an investigation into the nature of mind and body. It seems like when we think of the mind and when we think of the body, we attribute to them different functions. So what does that tell us, given that we attribute different functions to them, about the relation of minds to bodies? Says Descartes, "By body, I mean everything that is capable of being bounded by some shape, of existing in a definite place, of filling a space in such a way as to exclude the presence of any other body within it, of being perceived by touch, sight, hearing, taste, or smell, and also of being moved in various ways, not indeed by itself, but by some other thing by which it is touched. For to have the power of moving itself and also of perceiving by the senses or thinking, I judged could in no way belong to the nature of body. Rather, I was puzzled by the fact that such capacities were found in certain bodies." So Descartes is saying here, essentially, bodies are the sorts of things that exist in places and take up space and have particular shapes, but we can think of bodies as not having minds or as not having the functions of a mind. And in fact, it's somewhat surprising when we learn that particular bodies have mental functions, but that others don't. Why should particular bodies have mental functions associated with them, but other ones don't? The fact that that is surprising to us shows that mental functions aren't essential to bodies. It might be something that's related to bodies sometimes, but it's not the essence of a body to have mental functions. So notice what Descartes is doing here already. He is dividing metaphysically the mind and the body from one another. He started out just by knowing that he exists, and then he moved on to just describing the different functions of minds and bodies. And from there, he showed us that it's not necessary that bodies have the same properties as minds, that bodies seem to be able to at least sometimes exist without minds. And this tells us that there might be a separation between minds and bodies in terms of the base level fundamental sorts of things that they are. Now, I'm going to discuss two famous arguments that Descartes gives for the claim that minds are separate from bodies. This is where he really thinks that he's proven his conclusion that minds and bodies are metaphysically different sorts of things. Now, you might be able to combine these into one argument, or you might be able to split them into even more than two, and certainly there are other arguments in the meditations, and even in this meditation, in favor of the claim that minds and bodies are separate things. So I in no way want to be claiming here that I'm giving you all of the arguments, or the definitive list of arguments that Descartes gives in favor of the claim that minds and bodies are separate. But these are the big ones that you would hear about if you were discussing Descartes. First argument, that minds are separate from or non-identical to bodies. 1. It's possible to convince oneself that one's body does not exist. In fact, in the first meditation, Descartes does convince himself that his body doesn't exist, that he's just being deceived by an evil demon. Now, that doesn't mean that he actually is bodiless and being deceived by an evil demon. It just shows him that it's possible to convince himself that he doesn't have a body. However, it's not possible to convince oneself that one's mind doesn't exist. We saw that in the Cogito argument. Insofar as you can doubt, there must be a thing around doing the doubting, and the thing around doing the doubting is you, an essentially minded thing. But if, for any two things, it's possible to convince oneself of one thing with respect to the first thing and of the opposite thing with respect to the second, then the two things are not identical. So if it's impossible to convince yourself that X has the same properties as Y has, then X and Y are not the same thing. Now, Descartes really does mean impossible here. He doesn't mean, oh, you would like it if they didn't have the same properties, or it's somewhat baffling to you how they could possibly have the same properties. He really means that there's an impossibility in conception. And it's important that he's talking about this impossibility as a real impossibility. Otherwise, you might just quip, as philosopher Dan Dennett has quipped, that a failure of imagination is not an insight into reality. Well, Descartes doesn't think this is just a failure of imagination on his part. He thinks it's literally impossible to conceive of the mind and the body as having the same properties. But if that's the case, then one's mind and one's body are not identical. Now, there's been quite a bit of philosophical work that has gone on trying to make sense of what's going on in this argument and whether this argument is sound, whether its premises do in fact prove its conclusion. And there's more going on here than we can talk about in this particular lecture, but it should be noted that people still find this to be a very persuasive argument, maybe not in favor of Descartes' particular conclusions, but at least in favor of something similar to them. Let's move on to Descartes' second argument in favor of the claim that minds are not identical to bodies, that minds are something separate from bodies. 1. Bodies are essentially extended in space. This is what is called by philosophers and was called by Descartes in the original Latin version a res extensa, an extended thing. But bodies are not essentially thinking things, or what's known in Latin as res cogitans. Now, we've already seen why Descartes says this. Maybe some bodies have the power of thought or are related to thinking things, but not all of them are. But it's impossible to conceive of a body that isn't extended in space, that doesn't take up some space in a definite space. Therefore, bodies are essentially extended while they are not essentially thinking. However, minds have exactly the opposite properties. Minds are essentially thinking things, but they are not essentially extended in space. Well, how do we know this? We know this because of a number of Descartes' arguments, but not least of which because Descartes was able to doubt that he had a body that existed in space, but wasn't able to doubt that he had a mind, the essentially thinking thing. But notice now that bodies and minds have incompatible essential properties. Their essential properties are negations of each other. And if two things have incompatible essential properties, then those things are not identical to one another. For example, if I give you one thing and I tell you that it's married, and I give you another thing and I tell you that it's a bachelor, well then you know that I'm not talking about the same thing, because nothing can be a married bachelor. Or if I give you a description of one thing and it's a circle, and I give you a description of another thing and it's a square, well then you know that they're not the same thing, because those are incompatible properties. Therefore, given 1, 2, and 3, we can conclude that minds and bodies are not identical with one another. They have incompatible essential properties. Bodies are essentially extended in space, and minds are essentially thinking things. Now, how does Descartes make sense of his conclusion that minds and bodies are non-identical? Well, he has a very famous metaphysical theory that's come to be known as substance dualism. You recognize the dual part of dualism there, meaning two, and the substance just means sort of thing. So, according to Descartes, since bodies and minds are not only separate from one another, but even further seem so essentially different from one another, it must be the case that they are separate substances, essentially different sorts of things. And this position is known as substance dualism, the position that there are two essentially different sorts of stuff in the world. And one of the sorts of stuff is physical stuff, and the other is non-physical stuff. Now, this doesn't have to mean supernatural stuff, although it should be obvious to you here that if somebody believes in the existence of a supernatural being, or that our minds are somehow supernatural and that they transcend the natural world, substance dualism would be a position that they would be amenable to. Now, be very careful not to assimilate all forms of philosophical dualism to substance dualism. This is unfortunately a mistake that many philosophers, even many very famous, very smart, and well-read philosophers make. Not all dualisms are substance dualism. And it's unfortunate that sometimes philosophers of mind will put forward dualist pictures of the mind that aren't substance dualism, and they'll be labeled, because of people being careless, as substance dualists. Well, there are all sorts of dualist pictures out there, not only about the mind, but about all sorts of other things that are not substance dualism. So while Descartes is a substance dualist, and there are many other substance dualists out there, if somebody tells you that they're a philosophical dualist, you have to ask them more questions to figure out whether they're talking about substance dualism or something else. Now let's move on to the central problem for this Cartesian picture of the relation between the mind and the body in terms of substance dualism. People have proposed many different hypotheses for how the mind and the body interact with one another. And the position that the mind and the body interact at all is known as interactionism. Now, it just seems so obvious that bodies and minds interact with one another. The body is stimulated by things that happen on the outside, and then the mind perceives the stimulation. The mind makes decisions, and then the body acts because of those decisions. So it really does seem that, unless we're being radically deceived in some way, that the body and the mind interact. But our very, very best science tells us at least two things that seem to conflict with a non-physical mind and a physical body interacting with one another. First, our best science tells us that all physical effects have physical causes, and that all physical causes have physical effects. Now, if we want to say that someone, for example, having their finger pricked causes them to experience pain, then what we're saying is that a physical phenomenon, the prick of the finger, causes a non-physical phenomenon, the experience in the non-physical mind, according to Descartes. The problem here is that our best science tells us that can't happen. And in the other direction, if I make a decision to stand up and walk to the refrigerator, then it looks like my non-physical mind is causing in some way a physical effect with respect to my physical body. But our best science tells us that's not the way things happen. So we've got a problem here with Descartes' theory running up against our best science. And even further, our best science tells us that closed physical systems neither gain nor lose energy. Now, I myself am not a closed physical system, but all of the physical stuff out there, out in the universe, is a closed physical system. But according to Descartes' picture, the physical sometimes influences the non-physical. That seems like the physical is somehow losing energy, leaking energy into the realm of the non-physical. And sometimes the non-physical, the mental, influences the physical. And that seems like what we're saying here is that the physical is gaining energy from the non-physical. So we've got these closed systems, these closed physical systems, leaking and gaining energy. But our best science tells us that that's not possible. Now, making sense of how the physical body and the non-physical mind, if the body's physical and the mind is non-physical, interact with each other, is probably the most difficult problem that substance dualism faces. And it's the problem that has no doubt encouraged most philosophers to abandon substance dualism. Most philosophers are not substance dualists. They make sense of the properties of the mind and the properties of the body in other ways, rather than saying that they're due to the mind and the body being two separate substances. Now, it's important to recognize here that somebody who claims, well, of course, the mind and the body are just physical and that's how they can interact with each other, is gaining an explanatory advantage about how the interaction happens, but there's all sorts of problems with trying to explain what the mind does in merely physical terms as well, in terms of being a physical substance, in terms of having only physical properties, in terms of having only physical facts that it's applied to. So don't think that it's just so easy as to say, well, there's one and only one substance and it's physical. There are problems there too. In this lecture, we've taken a look at how Descartes' picture of the nature of mind and the nature of body arises out of his epistemological project in the Meditations on First Philosophy. We saw that Descartes claims that there are two separate substances, a mental substance or a soulful substance and a physical substance, or the sort of substance that bodies are made out of, and that these two interact with one another. We also saw that Descartes claims that the one and only one thing that you can't doubt is that you exist. And once we recognize that, we can see that our own existence is the foundation of any epistemology that we could try to build. Now, Descartes goes much further than this in the Meditations, and many philosophers have doubted that his conclusions after what he's done in the Cogito argument are sound, but at least it seems like Descartes showing us something very important about the functions and properties of the mind as they're related to the body, and he set up a challenge for us to make sense of what the mind does and to make sense of what the body does by taking seriously mental and physical phenomena. Thank you.